Our next speaker is Andrés Vázquez Quijano. He's a PhD student in the Philosophy of Science graduate program here at UNAM. His research focuses primarily on the epistemological and methodological problems of cosmology, exploring how scientific models, theoretical frameworks, and empirical practices shape our understanding of the universe. And the title of his talk is a meta-narrativist approach to the reconstruction of internal history, the autonomy continuity problem. So, Andreas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Well, yeah, so are you able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, hello, everybody. I hope you're having a great time and enjoying from this great event. And so before we begin with this talk, let me just give a brief outline about the argument that I am going to be presenting here. So intuitively, a historical reconstruction should satisfy at least two conditions to be epistemically valuable. The first is continuity, and the second is autonomy. The continuity condition would grant that the descriptions that we make of historical entities explain its time persistency. The autonomy condition would explain would grant, a sort of non-adaptness. I mean, a sort of explanatory sufficiency. If it is not autonomous, then we would need to add ad hoc modifications in order for it to be, we to restore the explanatory power of a historical reconstruction. Here, I will contend that the traditional methodology for the historical reconstruction of internal history, that is, the methodology of scientific research programs, does not satisfy these conditions. And so a different approach is needed to make historical reconstructions. Now, my research question is this: is the traditional methodology for reconstructing the internal history of a research program offering minimally adequate historical reconstructions for philosophical uses? And I will contend that that is not the case, because the continuity autonomy problem prevents this minimal adequacy that I'm talking about. Moreover, this will motivate the need for a different methodology for historical reconstruction, and I will offer guidelines to follow a meta-narrativist approach. Now, regarding the structure of the talk, I will follow these 4 steps. First, I will show that continuity and autonomy are conditions for minimally adequate historical reconstructions with epistemic significance for philosophical uses. And this will motivate the need for an adequate methodology for historical reconstruction. Then I will assess whether the traditional methodology is satisfying these 2 conditions, and I will show that the continuity autonomy problem renders this traditional methodology as defective. And that will motivate the need for a different approach. Finally, I will offer some outlines about following a meta-narrativist approach. Well, so to begin with, let me explain what I am thinking when I think in historical reconstructions. As David Hull puts it, historical reconstructions are descriptions of historical entities as they persist through time. For example, if we wanted to show how Newtonian dynamics have persisted through time, this is make the historical reconstruction, we'll need to explain subsequently the idealized planetary models. And to explain that, we'll need to explain how certain hypotheses shifted through time, and how the astronomical observations explain not only this the shifting of the hypotheses, but also create new ones, right? So when we're talking about historical reconstructions, there are 2 ways in which we can get together the historical events, that is, to colligate historical events. First, we can appeal either to a central subject or to a colligatory term. In the first case, the continuity of the central program of the central subject, is inherited to the historical reconstruction. In the second case, a colligatory term is simply a general thesis about a certain historical epoch. And this thesis is explaining why certain historical events are included and why other historical events are excluded. And so that historical objects are also continuous. So it seems that continuity is a central condition for appropriate historical reconstructions, right? So that's my first condition, continuity. Now, given this preliminary context, we can ask, why are historical reconstructions so important to philosophy of science? Well, take, for example, this question. Why have scientific products been so epistemically successful? There are at least two ways in which we can answer to this question. And the first is a priori. For example, logical positivists would say that science is successful due to the inner logic that is working between observational terms and theoretical terms. Falsificationism, for example, would say that science is successful because it holds provisionally not false theories. However, a different approach can also be taken, and that is the a posteriori approach, where epistemic norms are not only inferred, but also tested. This a posteriori approach would say that, for example, in the case of historical sciences, that is paleontology, geology, archaeology, all of these are epistemically successful because they satisfy three epistemic criteria. That is empirical amplitude, robustness, and coherence. Here, as I said, philosophical theses are also tested. For example, Hanson explains why falsificationism has been empirically refuted. So what this teaches us is that in philosophy of sciences, we have at least two sorts of issues. Issues that are susceptible to being answered in an a priori fashion, and some issues that are not answered in that way. The first one would be, an example of the first one would be the epistemic reliability of a measurement. There, in spite of the fact that you would need a reconstruction, you wouldn't need a historical reconstruction. However, there are philosophical issues that require us to think of science as a historical entity. For example, to explain the persistent epistemic success of science. So what this shows is that history has have turned to be into an evidential base from which, again, philosophical theses can either be inferred or tested against. In this sense, we can ask, how should historical reconstructions be produced in order for them to be epistemically valuable? Well, there are two ways in which we can make reconstructions. The first way is internal reconstruction, and the second is external. The first one relies on the idea that science has an immanent methodological structure of epistemic norms, and this internal reconstruction is aimed to show what this structure of norms is. It colligates internal factors, and that is observations, experiments, theories, hypotheses, etc. We also have external reconstructions, whose main aim is to show the sociological impact of science, and it colligates external factors such as psychological, social, economical, political, etc. factors. Right. So, from these two approaches, which ones should we choose? Well, it has been argued that internal history is epistemically prior to external history. For example, Nanay explains that to adjudicate the correct external reconstruction, you need to first make a reconstruction of the internal history. And he explains this, he illustrates this with the case of biology. The thing is that in order to adjudicate the correct external interpretation of Jenkins's objection to Darwin's theory of inheritance, we need to first assess whether Jenkins' objection is internally adequate. So in this sense, in order to solve an issue in external history, you first need to make a reconstruction of internal history. That same argument is also held by Lakatos, but he also exposes that internal reconstructions are autonomous in the sense that the issues of internal reconstruction seem to be solved internally. However, external reconstruction seem to be solved when you first reconstruct the internal history. Thus, autonomy seems to be also a minimal condition for epistemically value of historical reconstructions. Moreover, as I argued in the beginning, if historical reconstructions are not autonomous, then that means that you need to add ad hoc modification, which would ultimately weaken its explanatory power. So what we have here is that there are two minimal conditions for historical reconstructions to be philosophically useful. The first is continuity, which grants historical adequacy, and the second is autonomy, which grants explanatory power. Now, let me just briefly explain why I think that these are minimal, and are minimal because I am not holding any philosophy of any methodological way in which history and philosophy should be related. So that strategies would impose further conditions. That's why I think these are minimal conditions. Now, we can ask, is the traditional methodology offering minimally adequate reconstructions, that is, reconstructions that are continuous and also autonomous? Well, in the following section, I will argue that this is not the case. So recall that Lakatos's research programs consist in two sets of heuristic rules. The first set is a hardcore, which defines an unchanging set of heuristic rules, which define somewhat the properties of a central subject, which again persists through time. The second set is a set of sets, and these sets are protective belts, which are sets of heuristic rules that are shifting through time. However, the internal structure of these protective belts define the progressiveness of the research program, in the sense that as long as protective belts anticipate scientific change, the research program is going to be progressive. If it does not anticipate scientific change, then it would not be progressive, right? So now, to be clear, Lakatos's reconstruction of internal history will be minimally adequate as long as hardcores remain intact through time, but also protective belts autonomously anticipate the successive changes in the research program. However, in 1976, Musgrave made a series of objections to this methodology of scientific programs. And it's precisely that these two things do not happen. This is, hardcores not remain intact, but also protective belts are not autonomous in anticipating scientific change. The example that he gives is that in 1895, von Silliger proposed a modification to the Newton's law of gravitation, of universal gravitation. And so I think that we thought that would be in the hardcore, that is a law, is now taken out to the protective belt, right? But also these protective belts could not anticipate this scientific change, because this modification was not theoretically motivated, but empirically motivated, since von Silliger tried to solve the gravitational paradox, right? We also have a different modification of Newton's law of gravitation, which was made in 1983 by Milgram, and to also explain the empirical discrepancy between the velocity, rotational velocity of intergalactic objects, and the predictions that made this Newtonian dynamics. So hardcores, again, do not remain intact, and protective belts are not anticipating scientific change. So now let me think of this problem in an abstract fashion. So suppose that the hardcore of a research program is suddenly modified at time t prime, in the sense that a rule that was originally at the hardcore is now taken out to the projective belt. There are at least two ways in which historians can modify the historical reconstructions in order for them to explain this historical event. The first one is declining continuity, and thus reporting that a novel research program has been created. However, first of all, the reconstruction would fail to portray the central subject as a continuous entity. But also appealing to the inner logic of the methodology of scientific research programs. This novel research program would never be progressive because the protective belts would not autonomously anticipate scientific change. They would ultimately depend on the older research program, and thus this novel program would never be progressive. And so this is a highly counterintuitive conclusion. So this solution is unsatisfactory. You cannot decline continuity. The second solution is to decline autonomy, and thus suggests that an ad hoc modification of the historical reconstruction is needed. That is, to take out this heuristic rule to the protective belt. But note that in this sense, the first instantiation of the research program would have to offer hints regarding how this heuristic rule had to be changed in the future. For example, in the case of Musgrave example, the theory that Newton held, and his contemporaries would have to offer hints regarding how the law of universal gravitation had to be modified in the future, and that is also a highly counterintuitive conclusion, right? So as these two alternatives are equally unsatisfactory, the conclusion is that the traditional methodology is failing in offering minimally adequate internal reconstructions. They are either non-continuous or not autonomous. Now, do we have any alternative here? Well, in the following section, I will argue that a meta-narrativist approach might be of use in providing solutions to this problem. So before I make my proposal, let me just make a brief damage analysis. So Hull recognized that not only the properties, but also the persistency of the central subject had to be independently accounted for by a scientific theory. In this sense, we would need an independent way to account for research programs and theories and scientific theories. And the thing here is that actually we don't have a non-controversial way of thinking in scientific theories nor in research programs. In fact, the continuity autonomy problem shows that the account of research program that is giving the traditional methodology is defective because scientific change undermines continuity, but also as epistemic norms are non-universal, that undermines autonomy. Note that Lakatos' methodology has traces of an a prioristic answer to scientific success, and that is falsifications, right? In the sense that the falsification is not aimed at the heuristic rules of the hardcore, but it is aimed at the heuristic rules of the protective belt. And this is not this methodology is not universal, right? It is not equally shared by all the sciences. In this sense, not only is autonomy undermined, but also the philosophical thesis that can be either inferred or tested against these historical reconstructions that is offering the traditional methodology are limited. Either we can say that a certain heuristic rule was falsified, or we can say that some anticipatory prediction was success or not. And so we do not have a broad evidential base from which we can derive philosophical theses, right? So now, let me make my proposal. First of all, we have to stop thinking in research programs as central subjects. Instead, the underlying normative epistemic structure has to be thought of as a colligatory term, that is, as a general thesis. And this general thesis would colligate the internal factors of a delimited historical epoch. But also, note that even though scientific change is hardly anticipated, it is explainable post-hoc, appealing to motives of change guided by epistemic norms. I mean, this modification of Newton's law of gravitation made by von Silliger was hardly anticipated. It was hard to anticipate that exponential factor in the law, right? However, we can explain why this modification was added, appealing to the underlying motivation of being in line with empirical evidence. So we have motives of change that are guided by epistemic norms, and we have individual narratives of the limited historical epoch. Well, then we can colligate these individual narratives, appealing to these motives of change, and thus creating a meta-narrative. Now, let me be more clear about what I'm thinking here. What I think is that there are going to be various levels, various layers of narratives. In the first layer, we're going to have an individual narrative which explains the historical events of a certain historical epoch. And these events are colligated, appealing to a general thesis about the epistemic norms that are local to that epoch. But also, historical epochs are going to be unified, appealing to motives of change. And that would further make a second layer of a narrative that I am calling the meta-narrative, right? And so, in this way, continuity is restored. However, autonomy is not restored, but open to restoration. Because note that these motives of change and the epistemic norms that colligate the events in an individual narrative are not known a priori. That was what I defended at the beginning of the talk. And so we end up with a certain circularity regarding the evidence that we have for epistemic norms. However, it seems that in the literature regarding the case studies dilemma, the suggestion is to simply bite the bullet, right? For example, Kinsel argues that in light of this dilemma, we should weaken the evidential uses of historical evidence, of historical reconstructions, sorry. And Burian argues that there are some strategies that we can appeal to in order for historical reconstructions to be at least less biased. One of those strategies is longitudinal studies, which refer to a study of the limited epoch that would ultimately, in my view, be systematically included in individual narratives. But also, Burian argues that comparative studies would be of use in making historical reconstructions less biased, and that is to make a comparison of how scientists solved things in one epoch and in a different epoch, but also across sciences. But as this cannot be made in my view, this meta-narrative only partially habilitate comparative studies. An additional benefit from holding a meta-narrativist approach is that local epistemic norms are not longer limited. So the scope of the philosophical thesis that can be inferred or tested against this evidence is broadened. Yep, so let me jump straight to the conclusions. And so I show that there are two minimal conditions for historical reconstructions to be used for philosophical purposes. The first is continuity. It grants historical adequacy. And the second is autonomy, and it grants explanatory power. Now, I also showed that the traditional methodology does not offer minimally adequate historical reconstruction because due to the scientific change, continuity is lost, but also due to the usage of non-universal epistemic norms across sciences, autonomy is lost. However, a meta-narrativist approach may be better suited to offer historical reconstructions, since motives of change explain scientific change, but also, when known, these motives of change also explain local epistemic norms. However, as I said, these motives of change are not known a priori, and so we end up with a sort of circularity here. And finally, the scope of the thesis that can be inferred or tested is broadened, as we have now a broad historical reconstruction. And that's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andres. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And now we open the discussion. So please raise your hand. Kirsten.
Yeah, thanks for that talk. That was really interesting. I think I'm curious about how your proposal helps to kind of navigate historical disagreement. So I think you're probably right that about the traditional methodologies not doing, not meeting the criteria, and that the meta-narrative approach can. But I'm kind of curious about it seems like we need something more than just continuity and autonomy to be able to kind of deal with cases where there's a genuine disagreement about what the history is telling us about science. I mean, the kind of example I have in mind is something like, so Alan Musgrave argued that that a certain kind of novel fact was really important in kind of confirming scientific theories. And so, he ended up, in response to a bunch of kind of, problems and objections, he said, okay, well, he distinguished between heuristic novelty and temporal novelty. And then Stephen Brush came along and said, actually, novelty isn't important at all. This is just something that philosophers have made up. And actually, it turns out that being able to deal with known problems is way more important to how scientific change occurs. They both appealed to the same historical episodes, and therefore, and so they were kind of, but they had differing historical reconstruction of the same event. And I'm kind of curious about whether there's a way in your meta-narrativist approach that can help to kind of navigate those kinds of things.
Well, that was something that I didn't think of. But I mean, I think that the overall conclusion here is that, in fact, historical evidence is not only theory guided, but also theory laden, in the sense that Maria was asking in the last talk. And so we have to think whether historical evidence is able to adjudicate between philosophical theses. So I'm going with Kinsel's argument that we may rethink what would be the evidential functions that historical evidence can exhibit. So the concrete answer is I don't know, but at least there are ways in which we would think of better historical reconstructions and worst, and that would be that if a historical reconstruction can explain more evidence, and if it is gathering more kinds of historical evidence, well, maybe you will think that that is better, like somewhat justified. So maybe you can appeal to those criteria.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Maria?
Thank you, Andres, and thank you, Kirsten, because I am going to make a sort of follow-up on your reply to Kirsten. On the idea of making better reconstructions by making them more cohesive, having more evidence from different sources put together, I fear that one of the issues that we may have is that we end up with too much that make maybe inconsistent the subject of the reconstruction. So I'm thinking about things that change dramatically through the history of the concept, for instance, that they ended up being totally different things. So we might have had to cut in between and say they are two different objects that share the same label. So, or that the label is lost and the phenomenon is lost if you put attention in the whole historical development. Think about infinitesimals, for instance. So if you follow up the evolution of Newtonian infinitesimals, then you are going to end up having a different entity, which is the notion of limit. And so the history is already, in a sense, dissolving the entity that we wanted to reconstruct. And I was wondering, how can we identify the methodological guidance for avoiding this type of a scenario? So if the rule is just try to incorporate better and more information from different sources in a very well-tied narrative about what happened here, we might end up losing entities or having mutually inconsistent entities. It started in one form at the beginning and ended up in being a totally different thing. Maybe there are other scientific entities like dark matter or dark energy that started in one way and ended up being something totally different if you add all the relevant information under the same label. So maybe you have something to say about this, and thank you for your talk.
Yeah. So to sum up your question, are you concerned about things being dramatically changing in time that we might need at some point to change the label?
Yeah, so think about Evelyn's talk about logic and rationality. So if we look at the history of how logic or rationality term were used, then we are going to have many different things. And because the recommendation for having good reconstructions is to incorporate all that evidence that we have from different sources. So who knows what we would have in the end, but it's not going to look like logic nor like rationality. A salad of something.
All right. Well, for those purposes, I think that I would say that scientific change is inherent to science. And so even though the entities are changing through time dramatically, we can appeal to these motives of change. For example, taking the dark matter hypothesis, yeah, it started as being some sort of normal matter, but not, but only just not visible enough. And now we have something very different from that. I think that as long as we can explain these changes, then a historical reconstruction is going to be adequate. Yeah. So the thing is to have not only a broad base of evidence, but also a historical reconstruction that can explain the changes of scientific objects.
Thank you, Andres.
Yeah, thank you. More questions? I have a clarificatory question, Andres, because
Yes.
I'm sorry, I got lost. Can you talk about colligatory terms again?
Yeah, so colligatory terms are general theses regarding a historical epoch. So, for example, you could say that Mexican Revolution was precisely a revolution. And so that would be a general thesis regarding that historical epoch, in the sense that it would define the sort of changes that are happening in that epoch of Mexican history.
So that would be a colligatory term.
Yeah,
Revolution.
a general thesis regarding historical epoch.
Okay. And that works both in history and history of science and philosophy of science. That's more or less the idea.
What I was thinking is that as a colligatory term is a general thesis, you can have the philosophical thesis that the epistemic norms of a certain historical epoch in science are of a certain way. For example, historical scientists, paleontologists, geologists, etc., can say that in this historical moment of those sciences, the epistemic norms are robustness, empirical amplitude, and robustness. And that would that thesis that the epistemic norms are those and that they are arranged in such a way would make the general thesis that colligates the internal factors of that epoch of historical sciences.
Okay, I understand. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So I think we're running a little bit early, so maybe we can take 10 minutes, little break before the next talk. Maybe have a little coffee if you're in Mexico, not in Europe, because it's too late for coffee.
Well, even if you are in Europe, so maybe you are very tired and you need coffee, and you have already made up your mind of not sleeping tonight. So.
All right. So, okay. So see you in 10. Thank you.